When we consider the question of what does it mean to be human across time and space, one of the major questions that arises for anthropologists is, what do we do with the notion of progress? Do humans progress? And what does it mean to evaluate human progression? So that will be the topic we are discussing in this module. One of the ways that this topic is often discussed is to consider the transition or shift from hunter-gatherer organizations to agriculturally based social organizations. So often when we consider this shift and the way it gets discussed is to think of it or conceptualize it as an advancement, something that has improved on human experience. But we're going to, as anthropologists, interrogate this idea a bit more critically. We're going to think about what it actually even means to say that something progresses, and to think about where this notion may have even come from. So we're going to begin by talking about hunter-gatherer organization and agricultural organization briefly. So for hunter-gatherers, we're talking about communities that have 100 to 120 people at most. So we consider this a small-scale society, and members usually have some kind of family group, or there usually are some kind of family group, and they procure the majority of their sustenance, their food, from hunting and gathering. This is different from agriculturalists who get most of their food through cultivating plants. Majority of their sustenance comes from that, and they may also domesticate animals to assist with agricultural work. And here is the slide describing that. And one of the things to note here is that agricultural societies have higher populations than hunter-gatherer communities. There are also very few remaining hunter-gatherer communities in the world, and our film this week actually shows us a bit about a few of them. So one of the questions that arises is, how did this shift occur? How did we end up with this huge transformation in which across the globe hunter-gatherer societies have decreased and agricultural societies have increased? And does this represent progress? Have humans progressed and evolved to an agricultural state? So we have to really think about this. Often, from our Western point of view, we think that it must be better to move to agriculture. We have this idea that for hunter-gatherers, they live in a very unsafe and unstable kind of social experience, and that it's a very risky way to live, and agricultural work or an agriculturally based society must be much more stable. We tend to think of farming as very healthy and safe compared to hunting, which we consider to be very dangerous, often conceived as very dangerous. But Robbins, in our textbook, describes a lot of factors that many people have been talking about regarding agriculture and considering whether agriculturally based social structures are really an improvement. As he points out, there's in an agricultural society, you have higher rates of contagious disease, less access to protein, and higher dependence on grains. And in fact, one way that anthropologists know whether or not, or archaeologists know whether or not remains that they have found are coming from a strongly agriculturally based society is to look at dental cavities, because higher grain intake leads to higher dental cavities. With an agriculturally based society, it's also much harder to move if you need more food. So there's actually in many ways a higher risk of famine, because something could go wrong with your crops and then you don't have the ability to really move, and much harder to move to another food source. Hunter-gatherer life is is different than what we might think. Robbins describes this in our textbooks. He presents information on the Hadza and the Juwasi, which are two African cultural groups who lived as hunter-gatherers. And many of these practices are no longer possible for the Hadza and the Juwasi. This anthropological evidence was gathered decades ago. So it's important to keep that in mind. But traditionally, what they found is that the Hadza spent only 2 hours a day on hunting and gathering, and the rest of the day was free for relaxing and socializing. And nobody in the community was starving or homeless the way if we think about in the United States, we have people who are starving or who are homeless. Everyone in the Hadza community got their basic needs met. The Juwasi, very similarly, had a relatively low amount of work per day compared to our typical work life here in the United States. So the Juwasi, it was found, worked about 6 hours a day and also had no issues of starvation or malnutrition in the community. So when you, and there's also less contagious disease in these communities as well. So when you think about this, you can imagine that someone who is a hunter-gatherer would look around and say, an agriculturally structured society seems, first of all, like a lot more work. It's far less work just to go over here and gather some of the things that I need, or go over there and gather some of the things that I need, instead of putting all this work into farming, cultivating. And also to see that the level of income stratification in our society, I think, would be rather shocking to communities who've lived in hunter-gatherer structures as just their norm. So one of the questions that arises, okay, if we don't know, if we can look at these two forms of social organization and say, okay, hunter-gatherer life isn't necessarily harder. In fact, in many ways, it might be better than an agriculturally structured society can really provide for everyone. Then we have to ask, why did this shift occur? Why do we have the across the globe shift if it's not an improvement? And there's a couple of different ways to be thinking about this. If you take archaeology, this might be something that you explore in far more detail. One way of understanding this shift is to see that agriculture does facilitate population growth. So if you want to support a really high population in a more dense area, so less space, higher population, you're more likely to be able to do that with a largely agriculturally based society. So for a lot of hunter-gatherers, anthropologists understand that loss of access to land is really the driving factor pushing communities away from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle and towards an agricultural lifestyle, because to be a hunter-gatherer, you need a very large territory. You move to where the food sources are most abundant at different times of the year, seasonally. And so if you can no longer move around a great area because there's now a housing development or some kind of business being built in part of the land that you traditionally used as hunting and gathering territory, then that food source is cut off from you. And the whole system of the whole ecosystem of food sources within your area also will end up being shifted. So we see this as one of the major factors that has led to hunter-gatherers shifting on such a massive scale towards agriculture. So in some cases you have agriculture really developing because it does facilitate population growth, and it's a way to support a high population in a small area, so in other words, a very dense community. But on the other hand, you have hunter-gatherer communities being forced to shift because of loss of access to land that was their traditional territory. We have to notice that there's always unintended consequences with notions of modernization. So we associate agriculture with modernity, we associate building with modernity, different things like that, and there's always things that are meant to happen in those cases, and then things that are unintended that are also consequences that occur. This ethnography, called A Poison Stranger Than Love by Anastasia Shkilnik, really illustrates this. Shkilnik went to an Ojibwa community and really documented how 3 different factors that we might see as connected to modernity in some ways led to the destruction of their community. So the first thing was relocation. So the group had to be relocated due to other interests taking over lands that they were living on, and what ended up happening was when they were relocated, they were still near waters that they would traditionally fish in, but they found that upstream factories, so this is, factories, modernity, were dumping into the river, and so there was really high mercury in the fish. So the traditional fishing industry in the community collapsed. There was also a factory in town that was a major source of jobs, and that closed, which caused major unemployment. And then a malt liquor company decided to unload excess alcohol onto the reservation, which led to an increase or an epidemic in some ways of alcoholism. And overall, there's this dramatic increase in violent death and high unemployment, and it's just a truly devastating picture that she ends up showing to us through this ethnography. So when we think of modernity as progress, we think of agriculture as progress, we think of Western notions of medicine as progress, different kinds of technologies as progress. We have to really keep in mind that through all of these different things, there's unintended consequences. So even the idea that we could mass produce alcohol, a consumer good, through factory, there's all kinds of consequences that come from that as well. So one of the things anthropologists have talked about a lot with this notion of progress is not only the kind of factors that, the other kinds of consequences that come from these things we associate with progress, but also to notice that this notion of progress is culturally based. It's part of a Western cosmology. So in that way, it's ethnocentric. And so the idea is that we can trace it all the way back to the Greek philosopher Aristotle and his notion of the great chain of being. So the great chain of being is a representation of universal types. So in Aristotle's time, he wasn't the only one, but a lot of philosophers around his time, Plato being another, actually Aristotle was Plato's student, thought of things in terms of universal types. So you could find some kind of object, Plato's really known for this, some kind of object or being in perfect form that embodies it perfectly, and then we would know that that was exactly the essence of that being. So for example, there's somewhere in the world we could find a piece of paper that embodies perfectly paperness, and we would be able to discover the essence of paperness, but if we could find that perfect being. And then similarly, I guess that's a thing, right? Another example would be a cow, if we want a being, right? Somewhere in the world we could find a cow that embodies perfectly exactly what cowness is, and we'd be able to understand its essence through examining and philosophizing about that cow. And so again, it's this idea of universal types. And then, so the great chain of being is Aristotle's taxonomy or organization of these different types. So Aristotle was really into taxonomies and organizing things. So this is what he created, and you have a hierarchy. You have minerals at the very bottom, And then there's a sacred progression leading all the way up to God himself at the top. So you can see that in between is a hierarchy, a ranking of these beings. So you have, as I just mentioned, the rocks and minerals at the bottom. You have different kinds of plants coming above that, different animals. You have humans, you have saints, then you have angels, and then you have God himself. And you can even see men ordered above women in this hierarchy. So anthropologists look at this and see that there's a notion of progress, even embedded in this kind of depiction of the world or worldview or cosmology, organization of the world, where you can see that if you start low, you can work higher. There's a sacred progression of these beings that is inherently lower at the bottom and higher at the top, not only physically, but also in their worth and their sacred spiritualness. And this is a notion that stays with us in our culture in so many different ways. So we think of things as moving towards something greater, right? Constantly in motion towards something greater, which is the whole notion of progress, right? That implies that there's something that's going to be better in the end. So that is one of the big contributions that that anthropology makes to thinking about progress, and we'll be picking this up in the next presentation as well.